Tantor Audio, a division of recorded books, presents The Russian FSB, A Concise History of the Federal Security Service, by Kevin P. Riehle. Narrated by Nigel Patterson. Publisher's note. In this audio edition, you will hear references to figures present in the print and e-book formats of the book. Introduction. This book discusses the history, missions, and organization of the Russian Federal Security Service, FSB. Although a relatively new organization, the name FSB was instituted only in 1995, the organization inherited a long history of Russian and Soviet powers and institutions, along with many officers who began their careers in the Soviet era. This heritage endows the FSB with the aura and operational mindset of the Soviet Committee of State Security, KGB, which still active former KGB officers embrace by honoring the sobriquet Chekist. Yet the return of a pre-Soviet heritage in today's Russia and more recent memories of the chaotic 1990s modify this aura to give the FSB its 21st century character. Chapter 1 discusses the FSB's historical foundations that connect it with the Russian Imperial, Soviet, and 1990s past. Despite being one of the most powerful organizations in Russia, the FSB is covered in the West only superficially, often only in relation to its activities against Western countries, such as computer-based intelligence operations. However, the FSB is, in fact, primarily a domestic security and law enforcement service that permeates much of Russian society. It accomplishes its domestic missions through its enforcement of a wide range of laws and its authorization to conduct electronic and physical surveillance throughout Russia with little restraint. Those authorities allow the FSB to monitor and neutralize any embryonic manifestations of internal opposition or dissent within the country or their presence elsewhere in the world. The FSB has even resurrected a version of the KGB's Fifth Directorate, which was tasked with what the Soviet Communist Party called ideological counterintelligence. Chapters 2, 3, and 4 discuss the organization of the FSB, its intelligence, counterintelligence, counterterrorism, and law enforcement missions, and the backgrounds of the leaders who direct those missions. Although primarily a domestic security service, the FSB also has external missions. Those missions include being Russia's primary clandestine service within the former Soviet space, where the FSB conducts a variety of intelligence collection and covert action operations. The FSB serves as the Russian government's declared liaison with the security services of Russia's allies, through which the FSB influences those countries by sharing selected, ideologically driven intelligence. The Russian government also uses the FSB's role as a counterterrorism service to extend Russia's intelligence, especially its signals intelligence. Chapter 5 discusses the FSB's international missions. The FSB's reputation inside Russia is founded on respect and patriotism, mixed with a growing perception of corruption. The FSB conducts a concerted campaign to encourage the former, with award ceremonies, glossy publications, films, and public marketing that portray the FSB as the protector of Russia against spies and terrorists sponsored by nefarious foreign powers. Conversely, Russian media and opposition groups, such as followers of the jailed Russian political activist Alexei Navalny, often highlight the latter. A series of corruption incidents in the past decade has supplied plentiful material for the opposition's perspective. Chapter 6 discusses cultural representations of the FSB. One of the FSB's most potent levers of influence inside Russia is the patronage of Russian Federation President Vladimir Putin. Putin led the FSB for a year in 1998 to 99, and he has since overseen the gradual reaccumulation into the FSB of many powers previously housed in the Soviet-era KGB. This patronage gives the FSB the power to ensure that Putin faces no credible threats to his ruling position in the country. Nevertheless, as time passes, younger officers are replacing the retiring older generation, many of whom are in senior positions, including Putin himself. Chapter 7 discusses the FSB's future, which will depend on how the Russian government promotes or sidelines future FSB leaders. The data in this book come from a variety of Russian and English language sources. However, part of the reason for the lack of depth that often characterizes Western treatments of the FSB is a lack of source material in Western languages. Consequently, most sources cited in this book were originally published in Russian. Relying on Russian language sources has both advantages and potential disadvantages. Two Russian sources are particularly foundational. Andrei Soldatov and Irina Borogan's website, agentura.ru, contains a comprehensive compilation of material about the FSB and its sub-organizations. Their information is especially useful for its insights into the FSB's foreign operations within the former Soviet space, including in Ukraine, based on Russian media reports. Another valuable Russian source is a web-published work by the Dossier Center, a Russian dissident organization financed by an exiled former oligarch, Mikhail Khodorkovsky. The Dossier Center makes no secret of its goal to reveal the FSB's criminal activities, and it tends to emphasize negative stories about the FSB, demonstrating its ideological leaning against the organization. Nevertheless, despite the dissident nature of the Dossier Center's material, it provides original content, including interviews with FSB officers, that casts significant light onto the missions and functions of the agency. Sources also include Russian laws describing the FSB's missions and organization. These form the foundation for and set the limits of FSB operations, and provide a public veneer of authority and restraint. Other Russian sources include numerous national and local news articles that, based on the restricted media environment in Russia, often communicate a government-inspired narrative of the FSB's heroics and patriotism. They also report changes in FSB leadership, along with FSB activities and perceived threats that the FSB chooses to publicize to maintain its intrepid reputation. However, the Russian media also frequently focus on conspiracies and scandals that communicate unconfirmed rumors or paint the FSB as corrupt. Much of the reporting about prosecutions of FSB officers caught embezzling or extorting money comes from Russian media. The advantage of Russian sources is the volume of material they offer that is unavailable in Western languages. They fill many information gaps. The disadvantage is their often questionable objectivity, either in their slavish support for the Putin regime or their inexorable opposition to it, along with their tendency toward salacious stories. This lack of objectivity and conspiracy-mindedness requires careful use of Russian sources. Nevertheless, no study of the FSB could be complete without them. This book attempts to compile this information, supplemented by English-language data, to describe the FSB's history, missions, and organization as completely and credibly as possible. 1. Foundation. The Russian Federal Security Service, Federalnaya Sluzhba Bezopasnosti, FSB, is Russia's primary internal security service. Its foremost mission is to protect the ruling Russian regime. Its authorities in counterintelligence, law enforcement, intelligence, and border security give it a pervasive influence throughout Russia and in the rest of the former Soviet space. The FSB is built on the foundation of the Soviet Committee of State Security, KGB, and retains much of the KGB's philosophy and operational mindset, and even some of the same people. In fact, some Western commentators have claimed that the FSB is simply a return of the KGB. Even most Russian intelligence and security service personnel themselves date the organization's founding to 1917, the year the Bolshevik regime established its first state security service, the All-Russian Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution and Sabotage, under the Council of People's Commissars of the RSFSR, VCHK, or VCHK, colloquially called by its acronym Cheka. The Chekist label, which Russian intelligence and security personnel proudly embrace, is a remnant of that first service. The KGB of the past is unquestionably an essential basis for the FSB today. However, reference to the KGB alone is insufficient to describe the FSB. It is inaccurate to say that nothing changed in the state security apparatus of the independent Russian Federation. Yet these changes, rather than being in personnel or major missions, have been in the FSB's place in Russian history and Russia's government structure. The FSB is more accurately an amalgamation of pre-Soviet, post-Soviet, and Soviet-era forces. Some Western observers and Russian politicians concur about the indispensable role that a strong state security service plays in Russia. Robert Burles, of the Nuclear Threat Initiative, wrote, "History has shown, whether during Tsarist Russia, the Soviet Union, or Putin's Russia, that a strong central government that maintains a powerful internal political and security apparatus has been the only successful way to restrain the numerous centrifugal forces that seek to drive power away from the center and weaken central authority." Nikolai Kovalyov, the FSB's director in 1997 and 1998, affirmed that a strong state needs a strong special service. Conversely, a weak special service engenders internal conflicts, disunity, civil war, and other states' attempts to degrade the country, which bring about ruin and casualties among the people and a loss of national identity. Kovalyov's statement originated not with him but with Boris Yeltsin, who stated more explicitly as early as 1994 that a strong Russia needs strong special services. Yeltsin's opponent in the 1996 presidential election, the ultra-rightist politician Vladimir Zhirinovsky, wrote similarly, "Strong state, strong special services." The theme that Russia must have a strong security service threads throughout the entire existence of the FSB. Rather than being Soviet, however, the FSB is a Russian entity based on a Russian socio-cultural foundation, which in Yolanta Darchevska's analysis includes the Russian spirit, the Russian Orthodox community, conservative values, the mission of uniting a multinational and multi-confessional society, the community of experiences, the experiences of wartime, the spirit of service to the state, the dictatorship of law, and so on. Pre-Soviet foundations. Soviet-era state security services publicly made a clean ideological break from their Tsarist-era predecessors, claiming to have eliminated all bourgeois characteristics of the services that had repressed the Russian people. However, with the return of many Russian imperial symbols and cultural vestiges under Putin's leadership, the Soviet-era ideological antipathy toward the Tsarist-era security services has been abandoned. The Russian historian Mikhail Burenkov wrote about the Tsarist foundations of the FSB in the agency's own journal, FSB za i protiev, FSB for and against. As is known, VCHK elements actively used many normative documents and operational materials of the Tsarist-era police department in the first years of Soviet power, not only for the purpose of legal regulation of official activities, but also when organizing and conducting operational investigative, counterintelligence and intelligence measures. Such a public statement would have been blasphemous during the Soviet era. However, despite the Soviet Union's superficial ideological purity, the Soviet security services quietly assimilated many operational techniques from the tsarist security services, including the use of agents provocateurs, double agents, and disinformation methods, which were then passed down to post-Soviet services. Former KGB officers Oleg Gordievsky and Oleg Kalugin both noted that the KGB used pre-revolutionary Okhrana materials to train its officers in the 1950s and 1960s. Burenkov writes that it is important to learn lessons from the pre-Bolshevik period to avoid repeating problems that Russia solved in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Although the Tsarist-era security services clearly did not solve every problem, they did not prevent the fall of the Tsar. They are now portrayed as examples worthy of emulation. Focused on internal threats, both the pre-revolutionary Okhrana and the KGB conducted similar domestic intelligence activities and recruited domestic sources for population control and counterintelligence purposes. Burenkov highlighted several Tsarist-era police investigators, such as Nikolai Batyushin, a senior Russian military counterintelligence officer during World War I, Stepan Belyetsky, director of the Tsarist Police Department from 1912 to 1914, and Pyotr Zavarzin, who served in the Tsarist police for 18 years, who all argued for the necessity of domestic agent networks to protect the regime from internal threats. The penetration of domestic opposition groups was aimed at reducing the threat to the regime, often presupposing a link between domestic groups and foreign powers. The Okhrana's emphasis on internal security was founded on an unwavering assumption that foreign powers were meddling in Russian affairs, and this assumption continued into the Soviet era. A 1977 KGB manual used in training new KGB employees made the same point regarding external forces destabilizing the Soviet Union, using Soviet ideological rhetoric without tying it to the pre-Soviet era. By organizing sabotage of state workers, the exploiting class wanted to force the Soviet government to abandon the decisive path toward breaking the old bourgeois landowner state apparatus. By encouraging speculation, they tried to exacerbate economic ruin to drown the revolution in famine. With conspiracies and armed revolts, inspired by the participation of the imperialist West, the domestic counter-revolution tried to crush the power of the workers and peasants. Domestic surveillance networks, in which Russian imperial security services excelled, became a hallmark of the KGB, and continued to be used heavily in both the physical and electronic domains in post-Soviet Russia. Since Putin's ascent to the presidency, Russian publishers have released multiple books that recount the history of Tsarist-era security services. Pyotr Zavarzin's book, The Work of the Secret Police, originally published in Paris in 1924, after Zavarzin was exiled from Russia, has been republished at least 3 times in Russia, in 2004, 2018, and 2020. Nikolai Batyushin's writings on counterintelligence were also published in 2007. Alexander Shirokarad, in his 2016 book Secret Operations of Tsarist Special Services 1877 to 1917, explores the question, why did the great Russian Empire experience such a complete downfall in 1917 when it possessed the best security service in the world? Other books, like Alexander Kalpakidis' Special Services of the Russian Empire, a Unique Encyclopedia, Boris Starkov's Spy Hunters, Counterintelligence in the Russian Empire 1903 to 1914, Ivan Tarasov's Police of Russia, History, Laws and Reforms, and Borisov, Maligin and Mulukaev's 3 Centuries of Russian Police, trace the beginning of Russian security services from the Tsarist Empire through the Soviet era to today. Similarly, Vitaly Karavashkin's 2008 book, Who Betrayed Russia?, lists individuals accused of being traitors to Russia, beginning from ancient Kievan Rus through the Soviet era and into post-Soviet Russia. Tsarist-era anniversaries have also crept into the FSB's historical memory. In 2012, the Russian government issued a postage stamp honouring the 500th anniversary of the Russian Border Guard Service. That stamp commemorated the Order to the Ugrian Voivodes, a document signed by Grand Duke Vasily III of Moscow, father of Ivan IV the Terrible, on May 16, 1512, to establish a force of Ugrian warlords on the eastern border of the Moscow state to protect it from Siberian hordes. Although dating the establishment of the Russian border guards to that document is historically questionable, Russian border guards openly celebrated their tsarist roots in 2012. Nevertheless, the FSB Border Guard Service, along with the border guard services of other former Soviet states, officially celebrates Border Guards Day on May 28th, the day the first Soviet-era border guards were established in 1918. Vladimir Putin has publicly recognized the pre-revolutionary heritage of the Russian intelligence services. In his 2020 speech commemorating the 100th anniversary of Russian foreign intelligence, he noted that Russian intelligence and state security employees today are continuing the traditions not only of their Bolshevik predecessors, but also of those that served pre-revolutionary Russia. Such statements and publications would not have been possible in the ideologically restricted atmosphere of the Soviet Union. However, respect for Russian imperial security services is now encouraged. Post-Soviet drivers. During the Soviet era, the KGB was subordinated to the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and the security of the party was the KGB's primary responsibility. The most conspicuous change in post-Soviet state security is the removal of the party and the communist ideology's pursuit of world socialism as the ideological force behind state security activities. That allowed for discussion of pre-revolutionary state security precursors, but also led to a period of chaos, corruption, and politicization during the 1990s. Putin is sometimes accused of remaking the FSB in the image of the KGB, and to an extent that is true. However, while Putin's experience in the KGB was formative, he also experienced other formative moments, particularly related to Russia's military, political, and economic weakness of the 1990s. The 1990s were a time when Russia tried to build a new governing structure based on Western democracy and capitalism, rather than on Soviet communism and centralized economic principles. That attempt was largely unsuccessful and revealed numerous cracks in Russian society. Those cracks often involved the security services, which now bear the scars of Russia's 1990s weakness. In the first 5 years after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, several notable works appeared in the West that analyzed the structures, missions, and strategies of the intelligence and security services of the newly independent Russian Federation. J. Michael Waller completed a dissertation for Boston University in 1993, in which he assessed that the intelligence and security services were the only institutions of Russia that did not undergo real reforms due to Gorbachev's perestroika. Instead, the Yeltsin administration harnessed them for its own political purposes, rather than reforming or curbing the power they had possessed during the Soviet era. Waller published a book in 1994, Secret Empire, based on his dissertation. Amy Knight gave a similar assessment in her 1996 book, Spies Without Cloaks. Knight also asserted that Gorbachev himself was complicit in the August 1991 coup attempt in the USSR, and that he had collaborated with the coup plotters to prevent the signing of a new Union treaty, which would have transferred some power from Moscow to Soviet Republic capitals. In her analysis, the KGB never reformed at all, and Gorbachev agreed to retain it unchanged. Yevgenia Albats went further, saying that former intelligence and state security employees' violations of human rights had continued unabated in the post-Soviet era. Martin Ebon took a more sympathetic stance toward the Yeltsin administration, claiming that Yeltsin had been the target of a KGB assassination attempt and that he had tried to work with the new services to maintain Russia's security. The reality is that, while some aspects of the KGB translated well into the post-Soviet era, others did not. The KGB's human resources remained to a great extent, although there were significant personnel cuts just before the dissolution of the Soviet Union. One element that did not survive was the public reputation of the Russian state security services as the incorruptible protectors of Russia's security. Many in Russia viewed the KGB as an honest, non-corrupt organization. Yuri Andropov, KGB chief from 1967 to 1982, cultivated an image of the KGB officer as a selfless, upright servant of the state. Andropov himself contrasted with other Soviet Communist Party leaders by living a publicly irreproachable life, with no rumor of personal enriching surfacing during his time as KGB chief. The post-Soviet services did not inherit this reputation, because they became enmeshed in political infighting among the corrupt oligarchs who wielded political power in the country during the 1990s. Another concept that did not survive the dissolution of the Soviet Union was the ideological basis for state security activities. That included the main ideological pillars of the Soviet state, such as glorification of revolution and the communist ideological insistence that revolution was inevitable. That has been replaced by a rejection of revolution as a threat to a legitimate state, characterized by color revolutions, which, in the Russian state security interpretation, are perpetrated by nefarious foreign states to destroy Russia. The celebration of the 100th anniversary of the VTCH's founding in 2017 focused mainly on the agency's role in protecting the state from foreign invasion, rather than its place as sword of the revolution. The Bolshevik ideological foundation also led the VTCH to pursue any manifestation of capitalism or religion in the country as anti-state activities. That is the opposite of today's state security services, which are heavily involved with Russian mega-corporations, both to support their profit-taking and to embezzle money from them, and emphasize their connection to the Russian Orthodox Church. The FSB's relationship with the Orthodox Church is a particularly significant break from the Soviet era. Putin reportedly became active in the church in the 1990s and befriended Metropolitan Tikhon, an Orthodox priest who ran the Sretensky monastery near the FSB's Lubyanka headquarters. Tikhon states that Putin makes confession, takes communion, and understands his responsibility before God for the high service entrusted to him and for his immortal soul. Patriarch Kirill of the Russian Orthodox Church laid the foundation for a church on the grounds of the FSB Academy in 2012. The connection to the church represents a strong trend toward more conservatism in social issues within Russian society in general, and in the FSB in particular. During the formal blessing of the new church's cornerstone in 2013, the director of the FSB Academy, Colonel General Viktor Ostroukov, stated that the Academy's staff was concerned about what he called the increasing number of attacks on the Christian way of life. Together we can oppose these dangerous threats to modernity and preserve a great and indivisible Russia. The return of the Russian Orthodox philosophical foundation to the Russian security services differs noticeably from the official atheism of the Soviet era. Another post-Soviet driver in the FSB is the demand for political loyalty to the president rather than to the party. As the Soviet Union was collapsing, the Soviet and then Russian security services went through 5 years of instability and reorganization. The instability began in earnest on June the 12th, 1990, when the Congress of People's Deputies of the Russian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic, RSFSR.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?